Lehman Brothers didn't collapse because of bad luck. It collapsed because of a strategy that made everyone involved obscenely rich right up until the moment it vaporized $600 billion. And the worst part, every single person at the top knew exactly what they were betting on. So let's break down the entire scandal from beginning to end, starting with the decision that lit the fuse: the subprime strategy. In 2000, Lehman Brothers took an ownership stake in a West Coast subprime mortgage lender called BNC Mortgage, LLC. By 2003, they fully acquired it, and just like that, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment banks was now in the business of handing out home loans to people who probably shouldn't have had them, which is, not ideal. But here's the thing, it wasn't a side bet. Between 2000 and 2007, Lehman poured $221 billion into subprime lenders. That's not dipping your toes in the water, that's doing a cannonball into a pool you haven't checked for water yet. The strategy was beautifully simple. Borrow money cheap, invest it in mortgage-backed securities, pocket the difference. As long as housing prices kept climbing, it was basically a money printer. Hey Greg, want another yacht? Sure do, Greg. But here's where it gets dark. By 2006, 61% of subprime adjustable rate mortgages were being sold to borrowers whose credit scores actually qualified them for conventional loans with better terms. The industry wasn't just lending to risky borrowers, it was actively making safe borrowers take worse deals, because the worst deals were more profitable to securitize. The race to the bottom wasn't accidental. It was the business model, and Lehman broke two fundamental rules in investing. They bought at the absolute top of the market, and they put all their chips on one number: zero diversification. Every dollar was riding on housing prices going up forever, which, if you've ever looked at the history of literally anything, is not how markets work. The cruel irony is that this strategy looked like genius in real time. Revenue soaring, bonuses enormous. Nobody inside that building had any incentive to pump the brakes, because pumping the brakes meant making less money, and making less money was apparently a fate worse than bankruptcy. Turns out, no. Bankruptcy is worse. They just hadn't found that out yet. But the subprime strategy was only half the equation. The other half was the man steering the ship directly into the iceberg, with both hands on the wheel and a smile on his face. Dick Fuld Richard Fuld became CEO of Lehman Brothers on April 1st, 1994. April Fool's Day. I don't know what to tell you. He held that position for 14 years, steering the firm through one of the most profitable eras in Wall Street history, and then directly into a cliff face. Fuld's whole leadership philosophy boiled down to one idea: pick a strategy and stick with it, unless of course you're wrong. He was wrong. He was catastrophically, historically, almost impressively wrong. But here's the thing about being wrong when you're a Wall Street CEO. You still get paid. Since 2000, Fuld received $484 million in total compensation. That's salary, bonuses, stock options, the works. $484 million. That's not a typo. That's roughly the GDP of a small island nation. Except instead of feeding a population, it went to one guy who was actively driving his company into the ground. And the timing makes it so much worse. Even as Fuld was personally calling Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, practically begging for a federal rescue, Lehman was still spending millions on executive compensation. The building is on fire, and the guy in charge is stuffing his pockets with everything that isn't bolted down. Cool. That's also a thing that happened. When Fuld finally testified before Congress on October 6, 2008, 3 weeks after the bankruptcy filing, Lehman's stock had already lost 93% of its value. The firm had revealed $619 billion in debt against $639 billion in assets. And there sat Dick Fuld, defending $500 million in personal compensation to a room full of lawmakers, while 26,000 Lehman employees were cleaning out their desks worldwide. Hi, yes, I made $484 million, and also everyone who worked for me is now unemployed. Unrelated. He became the poster boy for Wall Street greed overnight, and honestly, it's hard to argue with the casting. The man collected roughly $480 million in total compensation and walked away, while the firm he ran for over a decade collapsed into the largest bankruptcy in American history. His strategy was to stick with it unless he was wrong. And when he was wrong, he just stuck with the money instead. But Fould's paychecks aren't even the most outrageous part of this story, because while he was busy being the face of corporate greed, his accounting team was running one of the most brazen financial tricks in modern history: Repo 105. So up until now, Lehman Brothers was reckless. Aggressive? Sure. Over-leveraged? Absolutely. But what they did next crossed a very specific line, because Repo 105 wasn't a bad bet or a risky strategy. It was a magic trick designed to make debt disappear. Here's how it worked. In a normal repurchase agreement, a bank sells securities to another firm and agrees to buy them back a few days later at a slightly higher price. It's basically a short-term loan. Everyone knows it's a loan. It gets treated like a loan on your balance sheet. But Lehman found a loophole. Under accounting rule FAS 140, if you agreed to repurchase securities at between 98 and 102% of the sale price, the transaction stayed on your books as a loan, and anything outside that range could technically be classified as a sale. So Lehman set their repurchase price at 105%. That's it. That's the trick. By overpaying by a few percentage points, they could pretend billions of dollars in debt simply didn't exist. They'd remove the assets right before a quarterly report was due, publish their nice, clean balance sheet, then quietly buy everything back a few days later. The scale was genuinely staggering. At the end of Q4 2007, Lehman removed $39 billion from its balance sheet using Repo 105. By Q1 2008, that jumped to $49 billion. By Q2 2008, $50 billion. They reported a net leverage ratio of 16.1 in late 2007 when the real number was 17.8. The entire point was to stop rating agencies from downgrading them, which is, not ideal. One Lehman executive described the whole program in an internal email as just window dressing. That's the smoking gun sitting right there in their own inbox. And they couldn't even do it on American soil. Lehman ran every Repo 105 transaction through its London subsidiary because the legal opinion backing the maneuver came from UK law firm Linklaters. No American law firm would touch it, so Lehman literally shipped its debt overseas, hid it behind a foreign legal opinion, and shipped it back after the quarterly numbers were published. Now you'd think the auditors would have caught this. Ernst & Young was signing off on Lehman's financial statements the entire time. They knew about Repo 105. They approved it anyway. When the New York Attorney General eventually filed fraud charges, Ernst & Young settled for $10 million without admitting wrongdoing. $10 million for helping conceal $50 billion in debt. I don't know what to tell you. This is the moment Lehman stopped being an aggressive Wall Street firm and became something else entirely. They weren't just taking big risks anymore. They were lying about the risks they'd already taken. And if you think cooking the books was bad enough on its own, wait until you hear what happened to the assets those books were supposed to represent. The real estate crash. Here's the thing about building your entire business model on the assumption that housing prices only go up. Eventually, they don't. U.S. housing prices peaked in early 2006. By September 2008, they'd dropped over 20%. And on December 30th, 2008, the Case-Shiller Home Price Index reported the largest price drop in its entire history. Not a bad quarter, not a rough year. The single biggest collapse in recorded American housing data, which is, not ideal. But the raw price decline doesn't even capture how bad things actually got on the ground. By March 2008, an estimated 8.8 million borrowers, that's 10.8% of all homeowners, had negative equity. Their homes were worth less than what they owed on them. By November 2008, that number climbed to 12 million. 12 million people trapped in houses they couldn't sell without losing money they didn't have. New home sales in 2007 were 26.4% lower than the year before. By January 2008, unsold inventory hit 9.8 times the December sales volume, the highest ratio since 1981. Nearly 4 million existing homes sat on the market. Roughly 2.2 million of those were completely vacant, just empty houses everywhere, with nobody coming to buy them. And here's where the defaults started piling up. Adjustable rate mortgage terms reset higher, monthly payments ballooned, and all those borrowers who'd been told, "Don't worry, you'll just refinance before the rate adjusts," suddenly discovered they couldn't refinance a house that was worth less than the loan on it. Turns out, banks don't love lending you more money on an asset that's actively losing value. Shocking, I know. Now, for most firms on Wall Street, this was a disaster. For Lehman Brothers, it was an extinction event. And here's the kicker. Remember all those mortgage-backed securities Lehman was packaging and selling? They'd been selling the good ones. The mortgages with decent credit scores, the ones that had a prayer of being repaid, those got bundled up, stamped with a nice rating, and shipped off to investors. The worst mortgages? The absolute bottom of the barrel subprime garbage. Lehman kept those on its own books. They literally sold the lifeboats and kept the anchor. By summer 2008, Lehman's stock had already lost 3/4 of its value. Then talks with South Korea's development bank for a potential takeover fell apart, and the stock plunged again. The music had stopped, and Lehman wasn't just caught without a chair. They were caught holding everyone else's trash. But at least when things got this bad, the federal government stepped in to help, right? The failed bailout. Here's the thing about the Lehman Brothers bailout. There wasn't one. And that's not because the government couldn't do it. It's because they chose not to, which would be a perfectly reasonable policy decision if they hadn't bailed out the company right before Lehman and the company right after Lehman. But we'll get to that. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson spent the summer of 2008 publicly insisting that troubled financial firms should not expect a government rescue. No more handouts, no more safety nets. Bold words. The problem was that literally nobody believed him. Not the markets, not Wall Street, and certainly not Dick Fuld. And honestly, why would they? Just 6 months earlier, the Fed had authorized a $12.9 billion emergency loan to Bear Stearns through JP Morgan Chase, and then created something called Maiden Lane LLC to absorb roughly $30 billion in toxic assets off Bear's books. That's not letting the market sort itself out. That's a full-blown rescue operation with a bow on it. So when Lehman started circling the drain, everyone assumed the same playbook would run. Sure, Paulson says no bailouts, but come on, look what they just did for Bear Stearns. On the weekend of September 13th, regulators convened leaders of every major financial firm at the New York Fed. The goal was simple: find a private sector solution for Lehman. Both Bank of America and Barclays were at the table. Both were interested. Both said the same thing: we'll do it, but only with government backing. And the government said no. No deal was reached. Monday was coming. Now here's where it gets complicated. Regulators later claimed they couldn't rescue Lehman because the firm lacked adequate collateral to support an emergency loan. Sounds reasonable until you remember that the Fed had been quite creative in bailing out Bear Stearns, and they would be equally creative the very next day when they bailed out AIG to the tune of $182 billion. Bear Stearns got saved, AIG got saved, Lehman got a funeral, and because Lehman fully expected to be rescued, it made zero preparations for bankruptcy. None. No contingency plans, no orderly wind-down procedures, no arrangements for counterparty obligations. When the filing finally came, it wasn't a controlled demolition. It was a building collapsing sideways into traffic. Within 6 months, roughly $75 billion in value evaporated simply because nobody had planned for the possibility that the government might actually mean what it said. Was it a principled stand against moral hazard? A deliberate message to Wall Street that reckless behavior has consequences? Maybe. But if that was the lesson, the government undermined it approximately 24 hours later when they wrote AIG a blank check, which is, not ideal for consistency. But the bankruptcy filing itself is where the real chaos begins. The bankruptcy filing. On September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And when I say it was the largest bankruptcy in US history, I need you to understand the scale of what that actually means. We're talking $619 billion in debt against $639 billion in assets. That's a company that owed more money than the entire GDP of most countries. And the gap between what they had and what they owed was basically a rounding error, which is, not ideal. But the debt number isn't even the scary part. Lehman's portfolio included 906,000 derivative transactions, 906,000, with a notional value of $35 trillion. That's roughly 5% of the entire global derivatives market, all sitting inside one company that just told the world it couldn't pay its bills. And here's the detail that should make your eye twitch. The initial margin Lehman had posted to cover potential losses on its $9 trillion over-the-counter portfolio was $2 billion. $2 billion covering $9 trillion billion in exposure. That's like insuring your entire neighborhood with whatever loose change you found in your couch cushions. The market reacted about as well as you'd expect. The Dow dropped 504 points on the day of the filing, a 4.42% decline, and the worst single-day drop since September 11th, 2001. But that was just the opening act. 2 days later, on September 17th, investors pulled $144 billion out of U.S. money market funds in a single day. Money market funds? The thing your grandma puts her savings in because it's supposed to be safe. That wasn't a market correction. That was a bank run on the shadow banking system, and nobody had a plan for it. The wreckage was immediate and staggering. Within 6 months, approximately $75 billion in value was destroyed, as thousands of derivatives were closed out and positions were liquidated in pure panic. Barclays swooped in and purchased Lehman's U.S. brokerage operations, along with its $960 million Manhattan headquarters, because nothing says good deal like buying a dead company's office building. Nomura grabbed the Asian and European operations. JP Morgan Chase, meanwhile, provided $138 billion in Federal Reserve-backed advances across just 2 days, $87 billion on September 15th, and another $51 billion on September 16th, just to keep the wind down from turning into a complete free-for-all. And the bankruptcy itself? It wasn't fully resolved until September 28th, 2022, 14 years. Lehman filed for bankruptcy when the iPhone 3G was new, and didn't finish paying creditors until people were walking around with iPhone 14s. The final tally came to $115 billion in mandated payments. 14 years of legal proceedings, asset liquidation, and courtroom battles just to sort through the rubble of a single company. But the filing itself was only the detonation. The shockwave hadn't even started yet, because Lehman's collapse didn't just destroy Lehman. It set off a chain reaction that would drag the entire global economy into the worst crisis in 80 years. The global domino effect. Here's the thing about dominoes. When you line them up just right, you only need to flick one. Lehman Brothers was that one. The moment Lehman filed for bankruptcy, the global financial system basically had a heart attack. Global stock markets lost approximately $10 trillion in value. 10 trillion. That's the kind of figure you'd see in a sci-fi movie about an alien invasion wiping out Earth's economy. Except this time it was just a bunch of guys in suits who really liked mortgage-backed securities. The Dow Jones fell 53% between October 2007 and March 2009. 1 in 4 American households lost 75% or more of their wealth. Not their stock portfolio, their wealth. Retirement savings, home equity, college funds, gone. Which is, not ideal. But the job losses are where it gets genuinely painful. Nearly 9 million US jobs evaporated during 2008 and 2009. In September 2008, the month Lehman collapsed, 433,000 jobs disappeared. By November, 803,000. January 2009, 818,000. Every single month, worse than the last. Employment didn't return to pre-crisis levels until May 2014. 6 years of recovery for something that took 6 months to destroy, and the jobs that came back weren't the same ones that left. Mid-wage jobs made up 60% of losses during the recession, but only 27% of gains during the recovery. Those middle-class positions got replaced with lower-paying service work. Add that to the list. Meanwhile, the contagion spread overseas like wildfire. Major debt crises erupted in Ireland, Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Cyprus. Entire countries destabilized because their banks held toxic assets traced back to American mortgages that should never have been approved. Close to 100 hedge funds had used Lehman as their prime broker, and when the firm went under, $22 billion in rehypothecated client assets froze overnight. The financial plumbing of the entire world just stopped working. Congress scrambled. They passed the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program. And here's the kicker. TARP's net cost ultimately came in at $31.1 billion. Not $700 billion, 31. The government loaned Wall Street a fortune. Wall Street paid most of it back, and the American middle class still ate the real cost in lost jobs, lost homes, and lost decades of wealth accumulation. I don't know what to tell you, but the numbers only tell part of the story. The 2008 crisis didn't just break the economy, it broke trust. Trust in banks, trust in regulators, trust in the entire system that was supposed to prevent exactly this. Every debate about Wall Street versus Main Street, every argument about whether the system is rigged, every protest movement born out of economic frustration, all of it traces a direct line back to September 15th, 2008, the day one investment bank's gambling addiction burned down the global economy. Lehman Brothers doesn't exist anymore, but the world it left behind, we're still living in it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.